Alexander Hamilton's participation in the Newburgh Conspiracy. So throughout the War for Independence, the Continental Congress and the various states were unable or unwilling to provide for the needs of the Army. The soldiers often went without clothing, without food, and without pay. Some in Congress wanted to do justice for the men who sacrificed so much for their country, but the national government lacked the power to tax and therefore never had enough money to provide for the soldiers. Upset at the neglect of them and fearing that the end of the war would mean being sent home without receiving what they were owed, discontent within the Army rose. Soldiers mutinied. Many talked of refusing to disband after peace was declared. Some even threatened to revolt against Congress. General Washington sympathized with his men. A look at his writings reveals that much of his correspondence dealt not with military matters, but with the inability of the continental and state governments to properly provide for the Army. Despite this, Washington strongly believed in civilian control of the military. In March 1783, an anonymous address to the officers circulated through the Army camp at New Windsor, New York. It called for a meeting to discuss the demands of the soldiers and to decide how to pursue their rightful claims. Fearing a mutiny or a coup against himself or Congress, Washington canceled the unauthorized meeting and called one of his own. At Washington's meeting, which took place at New Windsor Cantonment, Washington pledged to do all he could to help the men of his army and urged them to be patient. Washington was at his best. He begged the assembled crowd, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but also blind in the service of my country." Upon hearing these words and recognizing the sacrifice that General Washington made for his country and his fellow Americans, many officers were brought to tears and the so-called Newburgh Conspiracy evaporated. By early 1783, Washington and Hamilton had not corresponded for more than a year. In February, Hamilton broke the silence, providing his former boss with valuable information regarding the growing unrest in the Army, of which the commander-in-chief was not aware. Hamilton then advised Washington, "The claims of the Army, urged with moderation, but with firmness, may operate on those weak minds, so as to produce a concurrence in the measures with the exigencies of affairs demand. They may add weight to the applications of Congress to the several states, but the difficulty will be to keep a complaining and suffering army within the bounds of moderation. This your Excellency's influence must effect. In order to it, it will be advisable to take the direction of them. Your Excellency should preserve the confidence of the Army without losing that of the people. This will enable you, in the case of extremity, to guide the torrent and bring order, perhaps even good, out of confusion." Now, some believe that this letter shows Hamilton encouraging Washington and the Army to pressure and even threaten Congress into establishing funds for the Continental government. For example, Ron Chernow writes, "Hamilton was coaxing Washington to dabble in a dangerous game of pretending to be a lofty statesman while covertly orchestrating pressure on Congress. The letter shows Hamilton at his most devious, playing with combustible forces." But Washington did not see things this way. Replying to Hamilton, Washington wrote that he was pursuing the suggestions of your letter, which I am happy to find coincides with my own practice for several months past, and which was the means of directing the business of the Army into the channel it now is. Leaves me under no great apprehension of its exceeding the bounds of reason and moderation. Notwithstanding the prevailing sentiment that the Army is, that the prospect of compensation for the past services will terminate with the war. Thus, according to Washington, he and Hamilton were in complete agreement that the course to follow was to push for a funding system and to try to keep the anger of the Army within the bounds of reason and moderation. So how can Hamilton be coaxing Washington if Washington was already doing what Hamilton suggested? And if Hamilton was covertly orchestrating pressure on Congress and was at his most devious, playing with combustible forces, wasn't Washington doing the same thing? So on March 12th, Washington again wrote to Alexander Hamilton, "After the arrival of a certain gentleman, who shall be nameless at present, from Philadelphia, a storm very suddenly arose with unfavorable prognostics. There is something very mysterious in this business. It appears reports have been propagated in Philadelphia that dangerous combinations were forming in the Army, and this at a time when there was not a syllable of the kind in agitation in camp. From this and a variety of other considerations, It is firmly believed by some that the scheme was not only planned, but also digested and matured in Philadelphia, but in my opinion shall be suspended till I have better ground to found one on. So was there a conspiracy originating in Philadelphia? If so, Washington refused to believe it without further evidence. Was Hamilton a conspirator? If so, Washington didn't say so. In fact, Washington asked Hamilton to continue on the same course he had been pursuing so far. Let me beseech you, therefore, my good sir, to urge this matter earnestly and without further delay, to prevail on the delegates of those states through whose means these difficulties occur. It may, in my opinion, with propriety be suggested to them, if any disastrous consequences should follow by reason of their delinquency, that they must be answerable to God and their country for the ineffable horrors which may be occasioned thereby. So who did Washington blame for the ineffable horrors that may result? Definitely not Hamilton. In fact, he relied on Hamilton to urge this matter earnestly. Instead, Washington blamed the delegates of those states whose means these difficulties occur, i.e. those who refuse to give the national government the power to tax. So upon receiving this letter, Hamilton replied, I am happy to find you coincide in opinion with me on the conduct proper to be observed by yourself. I am persuaded more and more it is that which is most consistent with your own reputation and the public safety. So yet again, Hamilton and Washington were in complete agreement and were working to prevent dangerous combinations. So for the next month, Hamilton and Washington corresponded about how to promote the funding system and how to keep the Army in check. On April 4th, after the Newburgh Conspiracy was quelled, Washington informed Hamilton, some men, and leading ones too, in this army are beginning to ascertain suspicions that Congress or some members of it were using them as mere puppets to establish continental funds. Washington warned that the army is a dangerous instrument to play with. The critics cite this as proof that Washington was disappointed with Hamilton's playing with the army to promote a stronger national government. As Ron Chernow comments, Washington must have seen that Hamilton, for all his brains and daring, sometimes lacked judgment and had to be supervised. But Washington had not accused Hamilton of playing with the army. Washington wrote his warning generally and never implied that Hamilton was one of those men under suspicion. In fact, in his letter, Washington called out the financier, Robert Morris, as the one suspected to be at the bottom of this scheme. But he apparently did not believe this accusation. Washington made no mention of being Hamilton involved in any way. Less than 2 weeks later, on April 16th, George Washington apologized to Alexander Hamilton. My last letter to you was written in a hurry when I was fatigued. Possibly I did not on that occasion express myself in what I intended as a hint with so much perspicuity as I ought. Possibly, too, what I then dropped might have conveyed more than I intended, for I do not at the time recollect the forces of my expression. Washington then noted, to Mr. Morris, or rather to Mr. Gouverneur Morris, is ascribed in a great degree the groundwork of the superstructure which was intended to be raised in the army by the anonymous addresser. So yet again, Washington did not accuse Hamilton of being involved in this conspiracy, nor did he say that others had mentioned him as a conspirator. Rather, it was Gouverneur Morris who stood accused of encouraging the discontented. But this accusation of Morris came not from Washington himself, but from the very men who had threatened a mutiny against Washington and an overthrow of Congress, and who now argued that they had been used as puppets. Perhaps Morris had indeed encouraged these men, or perhaps these men were trying to shift the blame in an attempt to exonerate themselves. So at this point, there is no evidence that Hamilton was involved in any conspiracy. Some members of Congress had been accused of using the army as puppets, but those were unsubstantiated accusations, and only Robert Morris and Gouverneur Morris had been named as possible conspirators. No one at this point pointed a finger at Hamilton. Of course, remember, Hamilton in 1783 is not really that important. Later he would be. So let's jump ahead 40 years. In 1820, a man going by the name of John Montgars, who claimed to have been employed for several years upon a history of the United States, was investigating the Newburgh Conspiracy. Montgars wrote, a letter was received by the Commander-in-Chief from a Mr. Harvey of Virginia, then a member of Congress, advising him that a conspiracy of the very worst character, having for the object the demolition of our free constitutions and the destruction of the general's authority was an embryo and would soon show itself in some overt act, and that Robert and Gouverneur Morris and Alexander Hamilton, etc., were at the bottom of the plan. So here's the first accusation against Hamilton of not only encouraging a conspiracy to overthrow Washington and the civilian government, but that he was at the bottom of the plan. Yet again, the two Morrises also stood accused of being at the bottom of the plan alongside Hamilton. So who was this John Montgars? Was he a trustworthy, non-biased historian, as he claimed? And what was the source of his information? Well, it turns out Montgars invented this story, or at least he never provided any evidence to support it. Timothy Pickering, Nicholas Fish, John Brooks, David Cobb, Ebenezer Huntington, James Thatcher, and others all said that they were eyewitnesses to the events that day, or talked to people who were, and that Washington received no such letter from a Hardee, Harvey, or anyone else implicating Hamilton and the Morrises. Furthermore, it just so happens that this John Montgars was none other than John Armstrong. Montgars being an anagram for Armstrong with one R removed. Armstrong was one of the worst offenders in the Newburgh Conspiracy. He had written the anonymous address to the officers, though he denied it for decades, leading a number of historians to believe that someone else, possibly Gouverneur Morris, had been the author. Armstrong had also been an aide to Major General Horatio Gates, an old rival to Washington, who had falsely accused Hamilton in 1777 of having stealingly copied a letter he had received from Thomas Conway that was critical of Washington. It was Gates who probably would have become commander-in-chief had Washington been overthrown or forced to resign. Thus, the long-lasting enmity between Gates and Armstrong on one side and Hamilton and Washington on the other reappeared during the Newburgh Conspiracy. Armstrong renewed this rivalry in 1820 as he tried to change the narrative of the affair in which he was involved. With Montgars' identity revealed and his account refuted by other eyewitnesses, there is good reason to believe that Armstrong, as one of the conspirators, was attempting to shift the blame off himself and his friends and onto Washington's supporters, i.e. Hamilton and the Morrises. Certainly, Armstrong's accusations against Hamilton and others remain meager and unsubstantiated. This is how things stood for the next 150 years. John Armstrong was known as the author of the address to the officers and one of the leaders of the conspiracy. The idea that Hamilton and the Morrises were involved in the Newburgh Conspiracy was occasionally mentioned, but was not believed by most because the evidence was meager and unreliable. Just read any Hamilton biography written prior to 1970. Few, if any, mention Hamilton's involvement in any sort of conspiracy. In fact, the Newburgh Conspiracy was rarely used in Hamilton bios prior to 1970. Thus, until 1970, for all intents and purposes, Hamilton was given no role in the Newburgh Conspiracy and was not only completely innocent, but was also commended for being a great help to Washington in preventing a disaster by warning him and providing him with solid advice. Then, in 1970, Richard Kohn wrote an essay called The Inside History of the Newburgh Conspiracy. In this essay, Kohn argued that Hamilton and the Morrises organized the Newburgh Conspiracy. Ever since, this version of history has become mainstream, and Kohn's essay is cited by nearly all who write on this subject. Kohn's essay is far too long, 34 pages, and complex to quote here in full or to provide the relevant excerpts. Here, however, are a few short quotes from the essay that provide the gist of Kohn's argument. This is speculation. My speculation. Could imply. Imply to me. Does not imply. In no way implies. There is no direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence. The evidence is circumstantial. The evidence cited, as I admitted, was circumstantial. The exact nature of the group and its plans will probably never be known. No proof. Strong hints. An educated guess. Cannot be gauged with certainty. So there it is. The argument that Hamilton was a leading participant in the Newburgh Conspiracy is based on speculation, implication, circumstantial evidence, hints, and educated guesses. Even Richard Kohn admitted, of course in a footnote, that he cannot prove his case because the conspiracy was an event that never even happened, using evidence that probably never existed or was immediately destroyed. So, although Armstrong, Kohn, and their historical heirs accuse Hamilton of being involved in the Newburgh Conspiracy, there are a number of undeniable facts showing Hamilton to be blameless and even deserving of credit. Hamilton forewarned Washington. Hamilton and Washington agreed on the course to pursue. Washington followed Hamilton's advice. Washington encouraged Hamilton to continue on the same course he had been pursuing. Hamilton and the two Morrises became leading advisors to Washington after the conspiracy ended, which Washington would have never allowed if he believed that they encouraged a conspiracy to overthrow the civilian government and replace it with a military one. As the man to warn and advise Washington, and the one who fought for truth and justice throughout the affair, Hamilton deserves the utmost credit for his role in quelling the Newburgh Conspiracy. It is a shame that Alexander Hamilton has been portrayed by so many biographers and historians as a villain or as an unsuspecting contributor to the Newburgh Conspiracy, when in reality, he was one of the heroes who helped Washington save the infant United States of America from impending collapse. So I want to thank you all for joining me on this exciting journey